Hi again. Welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we looked at what happened with Finland after the Russian conquest. The Finns created a political structure and economic life that separated Finland from Sweden, and even though they didn't object to closer economic ties to the rest of the empire, they resisted Russification of Finnish politics and society. Today, we'll see what went down in Stockholm as the Russian Empire swallowed a third of Swedish territory. Episode 122, The Men of 1809. Things started to fall apart already in early 1809 when the war against Russia was still going on, and the continued existence of Sweden itself seemed to hang in the balance. Both among the officer corps and the civil service, there were those who blamed the king, Gustav IV Adolf, for all the catastrophes that had befallen Sweden. These men are known to history as the Men of 1809. Beyond their aversion for the king, they were inspired by the Enlightenment ideas of liberty and political reforms. To them, Gustav Adolf represented the past, a dying world of kings by the grace of God. Some of these men, who belonged to the senior civil service, had begun to limit the harm caused by the king's policies by delaying or otherwise not carrying out his orders. A kind of aristocratic deep state, if you like. But to others, that didn't go far enough. To them, things could not be put right as long as Gustav Adolf remained on the throne. A conspiracy formed to get rid of the king. In late 1808, the conspirators met at the home of Jacob Cederström, an embittered officer who hated the king so much that he wanted him dead. But as the conspiracy grew with more officers and civil servants joining, the plan was modified to merely forcing the king out of office. They decided that February 8th, 1809 was the day to act. The plan was to ambush the king as he was traveling from the royal palace in the center of Stockholm to his favorite residence, Haga Palace, outside the city. They would lock the king up and hand over power to his uncle, Duke Karl. But at the last moment, they were convinced to scrap the plan because they hadn't hammered out the details properly. That didn't mean that Gustav Adolf was out of danger, though. The ambition to oust him was still very much alive and kicking. Almost everyone surrounding the king knew a coup was being planned, but no one said anything. When, eventually, a loyal courtier called Kurt von Stedink tried to warn the king and suggested that he abdicate in favor of his son, Crown Prince Gustav, the king went ballistic. He screamed at von Stedink, drew his sword and called him a traitor, which is kind of ironic considering he was one of the precious few non-traitors at court at the time. In the end, the catalyst for the coup came not from Stockholm at all, but from the province of Värmland, on the Norwegian border. There, one of the commanders of the Western Army was so disappointed when he heard that the plans to ambush the king had been cancelled that he decided to take matters into his own hands. On March 7th, 1809, he published a proclamation stating that he was marching the Western Army to Stockholm to arrest the king, to bring about peace with Russia, and to summon the Riksdag. King Gustav Adolf was at Haga Palace when he heard rumors of the revolt of the Western Army. He hurried to Stockholm, but his courtiers, who were so sick of him, hid the truth, downplaying the seriousness of the situation. In the end, the king concluded it must have been a false alarm and went back to Haga again. So, for a few days, the king did nothing as the Western Army slowly closed in on the capital. On Sunday, March 12th, the rebel army reached Örebro, some 150 kilometers west of Stockholm. The city had been secured in advance by people sympathizing with the rebels, but a civil servant who was loyal to the king had managed to smuggle out a warning that reached Gustav Adolf that same morning. This time, the king realized that the rumors were true and that he was in grave danger. He immediately started to plan his counterattack, and in the afternoon he left Haga for the last time, riding into Stockholm. He decided to leave the city the following day. His plan was to go to Scania and take command of the southern army. It would then have to fight the rebel army. Sweden was at the brink of civil war. Courtiers, officers, and civil servants were dismayed to hear of the king's plan. They understood all too well that such a move would be the end of them all. Sweden was already at war with Russia and Denmark. It wouldn't survive going to war with itself as well. The Russians would gobble them up. but Gustav Adolf wasn't prepared to listen to their protests. He continued his feverish preparations for war throughout the evening and night. At around 3 in the morning on Monday, March the 13th, the king summoned the head of the Bank of Sweden, Fabian von Fersen, and demanded that the bank hand over a large chunk of cash to him. Von Fersen balked at the idea and managed to stall, claiming he needed the directory of the bank to approve such a request. A few hours later, at 8 in the morning, the king met with senior officers Wilhelm Moritz Klingspor and Karl Johan Adlercreutz to discuss the defense of northern Sweden. Remember, this was when Barclay de Tolly marched across the frozen Gulf of Bothnia to attack Umeå. The deliberations took place in the king's bedchamber, where he was both drawing up plans for the defense of the kingdom and packing for his immediate departure for Scania. Duke Karl stopped by and implored his nephew to reconsider and to stay in the capital instead. Also, Klingspor tried to convince the king to stay and to call the Riksdag, but the king refused to listen to wise counsel, as was his wont. Eventually, Duke Karl left, and Gustav Adolf and Klingspor were left alone in the king's bedchamber. Then the door flew up and Adlercreutz stepped into the room accompanied by 6 officers. Adlercreutz explained to the king that he had come to arrest him in order to stop him from leaving the capital. But Gustav Adolf wasn't ready to give up. He drew his sword and cursed the officers, and the month of March, which had also seen the death of his beloved father, Gustav III. Adlercreutz ran up and grabbed the king while one of the officers wrested the sword from his hand. But Gustav Adolf fought like an animal, and the sword hit the chandelier and the ceiling. Candles and crystals rained down on the chaotic scene. At the same time, the king's screams had drawn the attention of servants and loyal guards who tried to break into the room. Eventually, everyone calmed down, and the king's guards were disarmed. Some men, skeptical of the coup, still desperately tried to convince the king to try and save his crown by calling the Riksdag. But the king, ever his own worst enemy, insisted he couldn't do anything as long as he didn't get his sword back, and no one was interested in putting a weapon in his hands at this point. But Gustav Adolf didn't need to be handed a sword. Somehow, he actually managed to nick the sword from one of the men guarding him, and got 2 others to leave the room by pointing out that their uniforms weren't in perfect condition, and therefore they shouldn't be in the king's presence. Then he sprang into action. The king threw himself at a hidden door and managed to slip out of his bedchamber and lock the door behind him before anyone had time to react. Gustav Adolf then ran up a spiral staircase to the top floor of the palace. It didn't take the conspirators very long to break down the door and chase after the king, but by then he was nowhere to be seen. By this point, the conspirators must have started to get nervous. If Gustav Adolf would manage to get away to safety, their lives would surely be forfeit. As they fanned out searching for the king, Gustav Adolf darted down the main staircase. He was in such a hurry that he tripped and injured his right arm, but made it out to the inner palace courtyard. He set off toward the western gate and the outer courtyard where the palace guard was stationed. He expected them to protect him against the conspirators. But before he made it that far, one of the conspirators managed to cut him off and grab him. The king tried to stab him with the sword, but only injured the man's arm. Gustav Adolf's last hope was a servant who happened to pass by carrying wood. He tried to free the king and shouted for help, but to no avail. Soon, conspirators swarmed the courtyard and chased off the servant. They dragged the king back up into the palace, and when guards saw them, they explained that they shouldn't pay any attention to the king and what he was shouting. He was ill and confused, and the guards believed them. Gustav Adolf was now placed under proper guard and finally gave up. Exhaustion took over and he broke down, complaining of fatigue and a headache. Then he started to throw up. When things were finally under control, Adlercreutz went to Duke Karl, explained the situation, and offered him the position of steward of the realm. Karl accepted. The following day, March 14th, he published a proclamation about his nephew having been removed and that the Riksdag would be called urgently. Gustav Adolf was placed under house arrest at Gripsholm Castle, the favorite place for arrested royalty ever since the days of Gustav Vasa's sons. To begin with, he was kept away from his wife and children, but after Hedvig Elisabeth Charlotta, the wife of Duke Karl, interceded on their behalf, the family was allowed to reunite. A few weeks later, on May 10th, the Riksdag decided to officially rob Gustav Adolf of his title as king. And they also stripped his entire family, including the 10-year-old Crown Prince Gustav, of their right to inherit the crown. To justify their coup, the men of 1809 went to town slandering Gustav Adolf. They described him as unintelligent, unstable, and overly emotional, almost deranged, who let irrational feelings guide his policies, thereby placing the kingdom at risk. This image of the king lived on for generations, and to be perfectly fair, it's not completely unjustified. At the same time, the conspirators did what they could to erase every trace of Gustav Adolf's years on the throne. Medals that he'd handed out were recalled and replaced with new ones without his name or image on them. Various memorials, streets, and other locations that carried his name were rebranded. But the attempts to completely delete the memory of King Gustav IV Adolf didn't quite succeed. For instance, 3 parishes in Scania, Värmland, and Westrogothia that had changed their names to Gustav Adolf in his honor when he was still a child were overlooked and remained named Gustav Adolf. There's also a county in Finland called Gustav Adolf, but the conspirators no longer had the power to change place names east of the Gulf of Bothnia. Also, Gustav Adolf Square in Malmö is still named after the toppled king, but that may be because most people believe the square is named after the rather more successful king Gustavus Adolphus. In addition, there are 3 small towns in Swedish Lapland still named after Gustav Adolphus' wife, Fredrika Dorothea Wilhelmina. I don't know if they were overlooked, or if the men of 1809 didn't think they had any beef with the ex-queen, so they didn't feel the need to erase her name as well. Anyway, the next question was what to do with the now former royal family. Early on, the conspirators had decided not to go for the French option and have them killed. Instead, Gustav Adolf and his family were exiled. At the end of 1809, they were packed into a carriage to be driven to the naval base of Karlskrona. To avoid drawing attention to themselves, the guards escorting the ex-king were dressed like civilians, but with weapons hidden beneath their traveling clothes. From Karlskrona, they sailed to Copenhagen and then continued on to Germany, where they eventually settled down in Baden, where ex-Queen Fredrika had grown up. The Riksdag had put aside 100,000 thaler annually as a stipend for the exiles to live on. That may seem generous at first glance, but the majority of that sum was only the interest on the private money belonging to Gustav Adolf and Fredrika that the government had seized when they were forced to leave the country. The money would also only be paid out on condition that none of the exiles ever returned to Sweden and didn't move without the consent of the Swedish government. Gustav Adolf rejected these terms. He didn't want anything from the Swedish government, neither money nor restrictions. Shortly after arriving in Baden, he also pulled up the stakes and left for Switzerland, alone, without even letting his wife know. He lived for a while in Basel, and from there he notified Fredrika that he wanted a divorce. Gustav Adolf claimed that from now on he wanted to live a simple and peaceful life in a religious community with a wife that would give him many children. That wasn't Fredrika's cup of tea, so she agreed to divorce the ex-king. But in the end, nothing came of his plans for a life of peace, piety, and procreation. Instead, he spent the rest of his life moving from place to place, first using the alias the Count of Gottorp, and later Colonel Gustafsson. He did have several children with a string of mistresses, but he didn't marry any of them, and they don't seem to have been particularly religious either. In 1812, he came close to remarrying. His intended was a servant girl named Iselin, but none of the priests he approached agreed to marry them. And it was probably for the best, because Iselin gave him a venereal disease, stole most of his money, and eventually left him when he suggested that they should go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem together. In October 1833, ex-King Gustav Adolf was back in Switzerland and took a room at an inn called Weißes Rössli in St. Gallen. The local children would taunt him, shouting, King of Sweden," whenever he ventured outside, something that became increasingly rare. 4 years later, in February 1837, he died at that inn, a destitute and lonely alcoholic. It wasn't a very dignified demise, but his exile would actually end almost 50 years after his death. Then his body was brought to be reburied at Riddarholmskyrkan, the traditional funerary church of Swedish monarchs. It came about because Gustav Adolf's great-granddaughter, Victoria of Baden, married into the Swedish royal family. But I digress. In early 1809, Gustav IV Adolf may have been ousted and sent into exile, but that was only one of Sweden's problems solved, and arguably not the biggest one. The Russians were still firmly in control not only of Finland, but of a big chunk of northern Sweden, and they threatened to advance even further south at the same time as the Danes were rattling their sabers in Norway. The country needed a new king. Fast. Someone who could make sensible decisions to end the war with as small territorial losses as possible before Napoleon and Alexander decided to divide up all of Sweden between Denmark and Russia. So, Duke Karl was upgraded from steward of the realm to king. Karl, now Karl XIII, was Gustav III's younger brother and therefore the deposed ex-king's uncle. Karl had been close to Gustav III and always took his side in Gustav's quarrel with their mother, the proud Prussian Louisa Ulrika. Karl had also helped Gustav during his coup in 1772 and during Gustav's Russian War. Karl had loyally stayed behind to handle the mess left after the Angela mutiny. And, as you may remember, it was only Karl's refusal to take the crown that saved Gustav III from a coup in 1789. Karl had also served as regent for Gustav Adolf after his father was shot at the opera in 1792, so he had experience of governing, even though he'd left much of it to others. In other words, he was perfect for the job, at least almost perfect. There were two minor issues. First of all, he and his wife, Hedvig Elizabeth Charlotta, didn't have any children. They had a son in 1798, but the boy, Karl Adolf, had only lived for a week. The second issue was Karl's age, especially in combination with his health. He was over 60 years old already, and a few months after he succeeded his nephew as king, Karl XIII had a stroke that affected his health permanently. Sometimes he'd fall asleep during government meetings. When that happened, the ministers would just let him sleep and have him approve whatever they'd decided on when he eventually woke up. Come to think of it, most politicians probably didn't see this particular issue as a drawback, since it basically turned Karl XIII into their puppet. Luckily for the new king, he wasn't completely in the grip of the politicians. He could also depend on his wife, Hedvig Elizabeth Charlotta. She had been a driving force behind the aborted coup of 1789 against Gustav III, but now, when Gustav IV Adolf was toppled, she was devastated by the prospect of becoming queen. This was in no small part due to her affection for Gustav Adolf's wife, Fredrika. The new queen was a keen diarist, and she described how she was embarrassed at her coronation on June 29th because she felt like a usurper who had taken Fredrika's rightful place. But even though she'd preferred not to become queen, she did what she could to support her ailing husband as king. She made sure to visit him every morning for a private audience, and he considered her to be his most trusted advisor. Naturally, the politicians felt that she was meddling in things she should keep out of. Manipulating the king was their prerogative. One of the pressing issues where the new queen had strong views was the question of the succession. Considering King Karl's age and health, the country needed a new crown prince, ASAP. There were two camps, those who wanted Prince Gustav, the toppled ex-king Gustav Adolf's son, to be reinstated as crown prince, and those who basically wanted anyone else. Queen Hedvig Elizabeth Charlotta supported Prince Gustav, and she did what she could to influence the election of him as heir. In this, she was fervently supported by ex-Queen Fredrika, who felt that this would restore her family's honor if her son would become king after all. Against the two queens stood some of the most powerful men in the kingdom, among them the men of 1809. By now, there were generations of bad blood between the royal family and the nobility. They had murdered Prince Gustav's grandfather and toppled his father. Who knew what kind of revenge Gustav might exact if he was ever allowed to sit on the silver throne? One of these men of 1809 even threatened the queen that if she wouldn't stop advocating for Prince Gustav, they would revive the old rumor that his father, Gustav Adolf, wasn't the biological son of Gustav III, but rather the son of Adolf Frederick Munk. In the end, the queen was forced to relent and agree to see another candidate elected. The man chosen for the job was the Danish prince Christian August of Augustenborg. The Augustenborgs belonged to a cadet branch of the Danish royal family, tracing their connection to the Oldenburgs to a younger son of Christian III, who lived in the second half of the 16th century. Christian August had been a soldier all his life, fighting for the Austrians in the Napoleonic Wars. If you're wondering why his name sounds so familiar, it's because he's the prince who was given supreme command of the armed forces in Norway in episode 119 after the British attack on Denmark. In that role, it was Prince Christian August who had been forced to keep the war against Sweden going against his will in 1809. But he'd been fighting so passively that the Swedes counted that in his favor. The men of 1809 were particularly grateful that he hadn't exploited the opportunity to invade Sweden when the Western army had left Värmland undefended to march to Stockholm in revolt against Gustav IV Adolf. The men of 1809 hoped that Christian August, who was popular in Norway, would bring with him that kingdom when he became Crown Prince of Sweden, thereby compensating for the loss of Finland by adding Norway instead. This was actually one of the main reasons they pushed to have him elected Crown Prince. For his part, Christian August dreamed about joining all three Scandinavian kingdoms under one crown, but he hoped that crown would be the Danish one, and that the result would be a renewed Kalmar Union governed from Copenhagen. When talking to the Swedes, he was smart enough to keep quiet about this dream, though. We know about it thanks to his correspondence with his Danish relations. Christian August only accepted to become Crown Prince of Sweden once peace was concluded with Denmark, so he didn't actually go to Sweden before January 1810. When Christian August finally arrived in Stockholm, Karl XIII officially adopted him. But the elderly monarch had one condition. He demanded that the new crown prince change his name to Karl August. The name Christian had been a non-starter for Swedish kings ever since the Stockholm bloodbath in 1520, instigated by Christian II. The newly minted crown prince Karl August jumped straight into his new role, starting to take an interest in both politics and representative tasks. It didn't take long for him to become popular, for he was down to earth, fat, smoked, and spoke like a soldier, not some haughty aristocrat. He also took a genuine interest in regular people, or at least faked it really well. The Queen gave a rather mixed portrait of Karl August in her diary. She described him as good-hearted but awkward in the presence of women, a silent and boring person in social settings, but a good and honest man, even though he lacked talent and general education. But she warmed considerably to him when he disclosed to her that he didn't plan to marry and instead intended to adopt Prince Gustav and make him his heir. So the Queen may have come around, but the other Gustavians at court didn't want anything to do with Karl August. They were still sore that Prince Gustav hadn't been elected, and they did what they could to make life miserable for the new crown prince, making fun of him as a chubby and unsophisticated provincial. The peasant prince, they called him, and they weren't always careful to make sure he was out of earshot when they did. But Karl August had other problems than being snubbed by cliquish courtiers. His health wasn't the best, and all the way to Stockholm in January 1810, he had suffered from nausea and diarrhea. By April, he seemed to have recovered, but on a journey to southern Sweden in May, he fell ill again. The doctors that were summoned couldn't find any problem with him, but still it took until the end of May for the crown prince to recover slightly. On May 28th, Karl August went to Kvidinge Heath in Scania to inspect a regiment. He did so on horseback, but all of a sudden the horse bolted and Karl August fell from the saddle. He lost consciousness and didn't wake up despite his entourage trying to use water, smelling salt and vodka. His personal physician also tried bloodletting, but not even that worked. They carried him to a nearby vicarage, but by the time they reached the house, Karl August was already dead. He'd been crown prince of Sweden for 5 months. 2 days later, on May 30th, his physician, together with no fewer than 3 professors who'd arrived from the nearby Lund University, conducted an autopsy. The conclusion was that Karl August had died from a stroke. But the clear-cut conclusion didn't stop tongues from wagging. Soon, Stockholm was abuzz with rumors that it was the Gustavians who'd murdered Karl August with poison in order to make way for Prince Gustav. The main suspect were Axel von Fersen and his sister Sophie. Count Axel von Fersen was the brother of Fabian, who was the head of the Bank of Sweden. You may remember Axel from episode 118, when he was the lover of Queen Marie Antoinette of France and one of the men behind the failed attempt to smuggle the French king and queen out of the revolutionary chaos. By now, he was back in Sweden and had been promoted to Marshal of the Realm. This was a very senior position in the state apparatus, and as such, he played a prominent role in many state occasions. Normally, this suited him fine, because he liked that sort of thing: pomp, circumstance, bling. But now, when the crown prince he'd been bullying relentlessly was to be buried, Axel von Fersen's prominent role could prove a little awkward. On June 19th, the procession with Karl August's coffin finally reached Stockholm. According to protocol, the Marshal of the Realm was supposed to escort the procession through the city to the royal palace. The mood in the capital was tense, and pamphlets were circulating claiming that Axel and his sister Sophie had poisoned the crown prince. The crowds who had gathered to pay their respects to the popular Karl August were growing restive and increasingly drunk. Several people warned Axel von Fersen against participating in the procession, but he brushed their concerns aside. He wasn't going to let the rabble stop him from doing his duty. Besides, if he didn't show up, he was also worried people might interpret his absence as an admission of guilt. The procession started to move into Stockholm at noon on June 20th. All the church bells in the city rang out to proclaim that the crown prince had returned to the capital one final time. Axel von Fersen rode in one of the first carriages in the procession. It sported a gilded count's coronet on the roof, and it was drawn by 6 white horses with purple harnesses. 3 footmen in white liveries walked along the carriage on each side. Axel himself sat alone in the carriage, dressed in the robes of the Order of the Seraphim. In his hand he held the baton of the Marshal of the Realm. His splendid carriage stood out against the rest of the somber procession, all dressed in black to show mourning. It was protocol that forbade the carriage of the Marshal of the Realm to carry any symbols of mourning, but many in the crowds along the narrow streets interpreted it to mean that Axel von Fersen wasn't at all sorry that Karl August was dead. The procession hadn't reached particularly far when the first stones were hurled at von Fersen's carriage. Windows were smashed, and some stones hit the Marshal of the Realm, who started to bleed from his head. As the procession moved north, the crowd grew louder and shouts of "Murderer!" were heard as more stones and coins were thrown at the carriage. When the procession reached the old town, they found that their way forward was completely blocked by an irate mass of people who attacked von Fersen. People with sticks smashed all the remaining windows of the carriage, and the horses were disconnected. While the Marshal of the Realm tried to hide in a nearby pub, the rest of the procession simply moved on as if nothing had happened. Inside the pub, the mood soon turned hostile when people realized who the bleeding man in the fancy clothes was. Axel von Fersen quickly left, escorted by a few loyal friends. He tried to evade the mob, but as they moved north, people kept attacking them. They eventually reached the square in front of the so-called House of Knights. Here, the Svea Life Guards regiment was posted, and as he ran up to the soldiers, von Fersen cried out to the soldiers to save him. The soldiers reacted by lowering their bayonets against the irate people chasing the Marshal of the Realm, but the major in command of the unit ordered them to stand down, which they did. Now, nothing could save Axel von Fersen. The mob fell upon him and beat him to a pulp while the soldiers stood by, doing nothing. Only when the Marshal of the Realm was dead and the mob that had lynched him still didn't disperse, the authorities decided to act. They brought out cannons and ordered the Svea Life Guards to clear the square. But instead of going home to think about what they've done, the angry mob just moved on, rioting and looking for additional victims. The unrest continued throughout the day. 3 soldiers died, and so did a number of rioters. We don't know how many, but it was likely a large number. The shocked queen wrote in her diary that hundreds of people had died, but she might have been exaggerating. The authorities had worried about the queen's personal safety during the afternoon. It was well known that she was a close friend of Sophie, Axel von Fersen's sister, and the mob actually started to move towards Haga Palace, where the queen was, because they assumed that Sophie was hiding there as well. There was only a small guard unit at the palace, and they wouldn't be able to handle a rioting mob. The king could only send 2 boats that would evacuate the queen and her ladies-in-waiting if Haga came under attack. But in the end, the mob never left the city, and Haga remained untouched by the violence. Despite a thorough investigation into the events of May 20th, only a handful of people were arrested and only 4 were convicted. One of them was a man who had crushed von Fersen's ribcage by stomping on it. Even though it was never proven, it was widely assumed that the riots had been instigated by conspirators among the men of 1809 who either wanted another coup or at least wanted to break any remaining influence of the Gustavians by getting rid of Axel von Fersen. On December 2nd, 1810, von Fersen was laid to rest with all the pomp and honours that befitted a man of his rank and position. The lynching has been called the rock bottom of Swedish dishonour. Perhaps more problematic than the stain on Sweden's honour was the fact that the country was back to square one again. The kingdom needed a new crown prince, now more than ever. But how would the Gustavians and the men of 1809 possibly be able to agree on a candidate? Tune in next time to find out. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.